questioning whether or not functions have value, whether or not a particular function or a particular thing that exists, that is valuable or not. That's what I'm going to talk about today. Part of this stems from, I think, this idea in the West anyways, because of where I grew up and because of what I see as underlying morals and values within the culture and the society that I'm in. We tend to place our moral judgments on functions. So we assign them a value of good and or bad. And what we try to do is to obviously remove the bad functions while increasing the good functions. Different way of looking at things, and a way that it is a little bit more holistic in its approach, is not to question whether or not a function has value, if it exists, but to perhaps look at things as a function exists because the system has the variables in place for that function to have value within that system, regardless of whether or not that function is good or bad. So remove the value on the function itself. Simply let it be. Don't question necessarily whether or not that function has value, as much as within the ecosystem, within the holistic view of the whole, what is the function, and is that valuable per se as a function within the system, either as a function of accountability or as a function of backstop and or of value promotion. One of the things that we see, or that I see a lot, is people focusing all of their energy on questioning whether a function itself should exist. Having said that, the system as a whole will move towards having that function continue existing or not, simply by whether or not it continues to provide value. So if a particular function continues to exist as is, inevitably, that means that the system as a whole has the parameters in place for that function to essentially have value. And that function itself should not be questioned as to whether or not the function has value, because the system as a whole determines, or the parameters in place for that function to exist. And so instead of placing judgment on the function itself, the idea is the system has determined that that function is valuable, whether you agree with it or not. The parameters are in place for that function to have stemmed, for that function to have been created. And if really a function does not provide value to the ecosystem or to the whole, inevitably at some point it will die off. Questioning, the concept of questioning, or the function of questioning itself, is irrelevant, or it's irrespective of that function existing. Having said that, questioning is a function in and by itself as well. So if you're going to fulfill the function of questioning, do it extremely well, but remove the emotions from the mix. The idea is to look at the function as a whole, as a piece within the ecosystem, trying to be as neutral as possible when analyzing that function and its value. I know this is all very intangible to a certain extent, but think of it more so of like yin-yang, where there's the white and the black, and there's the which essentially forms the whole, and one cannot exist without the other. So think of good and bad. Good and bad are relative attributes that we assign to something, but they are in a relation to one another. You can't have good if you can't define bad. It's very difficult to qualify something as being good if you also can't qualify something as being bad, so that you can put them in relation to one another. That's what I'm talking about, the holistic approach, where it's not necessarily that one is good and or bad. It exists. It is. And for every function, there's typically the counter function. And so questioning whether or not that counter function or that function has value is kind of pointless, because one exists because the other exists. And so why is that important? Because if we focus our energies on trying to question whether or not something should exist, instead of focusing our energies on doing something, we are in a way not adding as much value as we could, other than if our function is actually the questioning. Maybe that is the function. Maybe that is your role. Maybe that is the function that you're providing to the ecosystem. Then that's good. If everybody focused on what they can do, think about like all the different pieces of the puzzle in a giant puzzle. And if you just focused on what it is you're able to bring to the table, and you just really do that really well, and if everybody did that, we wouldn't be able to predict what all functions are required, but we would see it come organically, and the system as a whole would be stronger. Instead of questioning whether or not a puzzle piece should even be a part of the puzzle. The puzzle does not care whether or not that particular piece has value or not. It's functional because it has a place within the ecosystem. It's kind of a rant here. The idea being, stop focusing on what other people are doing and whether or not it has value. Focus on what you can do. What can you do in order to bring value to the ecosystem? What can you do to add? Which piece of the puzzle are you? Do that. Do it really, really well. And the system as a whole will be stronger. Stop thinking of the other people. What are you doing to help contribute to the ecosystem? Focus on that. What do you think?